tell you to do?
Burn, kill, destroy.
Okay, burn, kill, destroy what?
Anything.
My name is Nick, and I'm going to be the next school shooter of 2018.
It's curious how certain silences say more than any word. And in that crowded courtroom, Nikolas Cruz's silence was unsettling. Sitting in the defendant's chair, he kept his head down, his shoulders hunched, his whole body folded inward as if trying to disappear. It wasn't remorse, nor humility. It was a kind of apathy that seemed to defy the weight of the tragedy. The families of the victims were only a few feet away, but it was as if he didn't see anyone. He didn't look at the parents who lost their children, didn't look at the survivors who spent weeks fighting to regain movement in their bodies. He just stared at the table in front of him, still and indifferent, as if he were back in the old room where he spent hours surrounded by weapons, photos of dead animals, and thoughts no one ever managed to control. The prosecution spoke. The defense tried to argue. Witnesses cried. And him? Nothing. His face hidden behind messy bangs, his restless hands without rhythm, his foot tapping the floor as if he were somewhere else. These small cracks in his behavior exposed a disturbed mind. And that was exactly what divided the courtroom. On one side, those who believed he represented pure evil. On the other, those who saw him as the product of accumulated neglect, a warning ignored by society. But while the courtroom tried to interpret that behavior, another question floated in the air. How does someone get here? How does a teenager with so many warning signs walk freely and armed into the center of one of the worst school tragedies in the United States? To understand the weight of those walls, it was necessary to go back in time. Back to the moment when Nikolas Cruz decided to turn an ordinary day into a massacre. And that decision began long before the trigger was pulled. On February 14, 2018, the world was waking up calmly. In Parkland, school life moved along its usual rhythm, students chatting in hallways, teachers organizing tests, couples exchanging Valentine's Day cards. No one imagined that a 19-year-old, expelled from that same school months earlier, was on his way carrying a gun case large enough to hold an entire tragedy inside it. Nikolas walked through the main gate of Stoneman Douglas High School without drawing attention. He wore a red shirt, dark pants, and carried a large black case where he hid the AR-15 rifle. A security guard saw him walking, recognized him, and felt uneasy, but before he could react, Cruz was already moving inside the building. He climbed the stairs to the third floor, opened the case, assembled the weapon, and that's where it all began. He pulled the fire alarm. The hallway, which a second earlier was just a normal hallway, turned into a death trap. Students left classrooms believing it was only a drill or a system glitch. Cruz waited for some of them to get close. And then he started shooting. The shots filled the corridors, pierced walls, shattered doors, unleashed screams. Some teachers pushed students back inside classrooms. Others tried to lock doors with their own hands. Each bullet seemed to carry the twisted path of a young man who had always shown signs that this could happen, and no one managed to stop it. Within minutes, the floor was covered with torn backpacks, notebooks stained with blood, cell phones vibrating without answers. Smoke spread, the alarm kept blaring, and chaos turned into desperation. Cruz walked calmly, aiming, reloading with calculated coldness. Sometimes he looked around as if analyzing his own disaster. When he finished, he dropped the weapon, left the backpack on the floor, and walked down the stairs blending in with the students fleeing the building. The calmness with which he left became one of the most disturbing details of the case. Within minutes, he was walking down quiet streets, entering a Walmart, ordering a drink at McDonald's, and moving as if nothing had happened. He was arrested shortly after, without resisting, as if everything were already over in his mind. His silence, his apathy, the almost childlike way he answered authorities, all of it would later disturb the courtroom again. But in that moment, in that sterile room where he confessed what he had done, it was already clear that the trial would be as complex as the crime itself. The interrogation of Nikolas Cruz is one of the most unsettling parts of the entire case. Not because of what he said, but because of the way he said it. The moment he entered the small white room, handcuffed and with a drained face, he looked more like a disoriented teenager than the author of a massacre. He sat with his head down, breathing fast and unevenly, as if his own body were trying to hide what his mind had already decided hours earlier. When the detective began the questions, Cruz answered almost always with short phrases, low voice, almost childlike. He admitted being the shooter without resistance, like someone revealing a secret that no longer makes sense to keep. He didn't try to justify, didn't try to escape, didn't try to blame anyone. He just confessed. But the tone wasn't remorse, it was apathy. At several moments, while speaking about killing 17 people, his hands trembled and his voice cracked, not from guilt, but from a strange mix of anxiety and emptiness. He said he felt a demon inside him, mentioned hearing voices, but couldn't sustain those claims with conviction. The interrogation revealed something uncomfortable. Nikolas Cruz seemed to understand what he did, without truly grasping the weight of what he caused. In court years later, he seemed to carry the scars of that day. Each testimony reopened wounds. Each photo presented by the prosecution made someone break into tears. And Nikolas remained seated, eyes lowered, body tense, hands intertwined as if holding himself together. It was impossible not to feel the contrast. A young man who, on an ordinary day, was capable of massacring dozens of people, and now could barely lift his head. The trial unfolded like an emotional battlefield. On one side, parents who saw their children leave home for school and never return. On the other, attorneys trying to explain the path of a young man full of disorders, abandonments, and episodes of domestic violence. And at the center of everything, Cruz himself, carrying that lost stare no one could interpret. Was it guilt? Was it fear? Was it emptiness? And while the room waited for the final decision, one last piece of this terrifying story was still missing. The sentence that would place an ending on his fate and determine what would remain of that tragedy. When the final phase of the trial began, the tension in the room seemed to gain weight. At each step taken by the attorneys, each document shown, each new testimony, it was clear the environment was being shaped by emotions accumulated throughout years. The victims' parents sat in silence, some with photos of their children in their laps, others holding rosaries, others just squeezing each other's hands as if that could keep their hearts from exploding. And Nikolas Cruz remained there, unable to look at what he had caused. 4 hours, the prosecution presented videos, audios, and images from the day of the massacre. Security camera recordings were shown, and each second felt like a direct blow to the room. There were people who couldn't look, there were others who couldn't turn away. And at the center of everything, Cruz watched through quick glances, as if trying to process it and at the same time flee from the memory of what he did. The defense tried to play the most thankless role of that courtroom, convincing the jury that there were deep layers in Nikolas's mind that explained, but didn't justify, the massacre. Psychiatrists described neurological delays since childhood, multiple diagnoses, extreme impulsivity, cognitive problems, and an emotional spiral that never received proper treatment. They spoke about his mother's death, about the sequence of abandonments, about the fact that he spent much of his life trying to fit into a world that, to him, seemed made of broken glass. But the prosecution answered with the same firmness: written plans, research, videos, posts, explicit threats, legal purchase of the weapon, calculated assembly of the attack. It wasn't an impulsive explosion, it was preparation. It was intention. It was choice. And that conflict, between mental deterioration and cold premeditation, became the core of the trial. A moral, legal, and emotional duel that left the public divided, the jury pressured, and the families shattered. At a certain moment, Nikolas asked to speak. He stood up, trembling slightly, and did what many had expected for years: he apologized. But the words, though articulated, came out like disconnected fragments from a young man who seemed not to know how to handle his own voice. He said he felt remorse, that he wished the victims had survived, that he wanted to donate money, that he wanted to help someone in the future. Many considered those phrases confused, misaligned, even uncomfortable. Others sensed that there was something there, not necessarily remorse, maybe just the echo of a destroyed mind trying to understand its own ruin.
I'm very sorry for what I did, and I have to live with it every day. And that if I were to get a second chance, I will do everything in my power to try to help others. And I am doing this for you, and I do not care if you do not believe me.
As he spoke, some mothers turned their faces away to avoid seeing him. Some fathers stared at him with contempt, as if trying to pierce through his chest with their eyes. There were those who cried without sound. There were those who didn't move a muscle. And even amid all of that, the prevailing feeling was just one: no word would be enough. Nothing that came from his mouth would ever return the lives he took. The jury withdrew to deliberate. Minutes turned into hours. Hours felt like days. The tension was so great that no one could even take a deep breath. When they finally returned, the courtroom fell into a silence that felt sacred or profane. There was no middle ground. Everyone knew that what came next would define forever the image of that massacre. The judge asked for the verdict to be read. It was necessary for all jurors to agree for the death penalty to be applied. But unanimity did not happen. Some jurors considered his psychological disorders enough to mitigate the extreme punishment. And the result fell over the room like an unexpected weight. Nikolas Cruz would receive 34 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Upon hearing the sentence, he merely lowered his head, squeezing his hands between his knees. Some witnesses collapsed into tears, not from relief, but from frustration. Others, with trembling voices, said justice was not complete. Many parents believed he deserved to die for what he did. Others felt that letting him live, driven by guilt, was a greater punishment. Regardless of opinions, one truth prevailed. The decision was made, and the world would need to move forward, even if moving forward wasn't the same as forgetting. The judge concluded the case with firm words that echoed like hammer strikes. Cruz will live the rest of his life isolated, incarcerated, removed from any possibility of harming someone again. And so the young man who walked calmly after one of the biggest school massacres in history was taken to the prison where he would spend, day after day, facing his own silence. The same silence he carried in the courtroom, the same silence that became part of his face, part of his story, part of the tragedy he left behind. Even if many try to understand the causes of this disaster, there is no explanation that eases the weight of this loss. But the case of Nikolas Cruz remains a brutal reminder of something larger. Tragedies like this don't come from nowhere. They are built, ignored, fed. They are the result of signs seen too late, failed decisions, untreated fears, oversights that pile up like dry matches waiting for a spark. As this account closes, perhaps only one clear reflection remains. It doesn't matter how many years pass, how many trials take place, or how many sentences are read, the deepest wound will never be in the criminal record, but in the lives of the families whose destinies were taken in that hallway.